So welcome, and I'm sorry the travel was so difficult from the other side of the city. Also welcome to guests who were not part of the seminar. And I'm going to get going with my talk. So I work at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London, England, but I'm also on the management board of the SIMM platform. So that's why there's a dual attribution on the first slide. So I'm going to be talking about research into social impact of making music, issues and dilemmas. So what brings us together, both in this seminar that we've just finished, but also in the wider activities of the SIMM platform, is a relatively new type of professional musical practice. And I don't think we need to go into the specific history of it, but we're talking about a practice which has really only coalesced in recent decades. And typical characteristics of this practice, and I stress, not every practice has to have all of these characteristics all of the time, but a kind of central, typical practice is we're talking about group music making with people of diverse abilities, including people who perhaps have little or no musical training. This group music making is facilitated or led by professional musicians and other kinds of artists. In general, the activity is inclusive in that there are no auditions or prior level of musical training or ability that's demanded before the activity can start. It tends to be voluntary in the sense that people can decide for themselves whether to be part of this or not, which means, in general, this activity is less likely to be found within a required curriculum where you are telling everybody you have to do this. And I put the next two characteristics in red because I think they come to the nub of it. These activities aim to create performances or results of some artistic aesthetic value to the people involved, but also maybe to audiences that witness this work as well. And crucially, they aim to promote some explicit social, that is to say, extra musical, outside music outcomes for the participants. And it's that dual artistic aim and non-artistic aim which defines the kind of work which we generally are interested in. And finally, increasingly, these kinds of activities present themselves publicly as having a social purpose. It's not implicit, it's explicit, including to funders, sponsors, and perhaps the public itself. So the SIMM platform, which, as it were, exists to talk about and support this kind of work, came into existence because a club of individuals interested in research into this practice convened. And they first convened in a public way in 2015 at a symposium in Ghent, not far from here, which was convened by Lucas Pyron, who, for those of you who don't know, is both a musical social entrepreneur and a researcher. And because of the situationality of the enterprise and what was possible and available, this was formed as a charitable organisation under Belgian law in 2017, with a management board consisting of 13 senior individuals from 7 countries. And that management board is what, in a sense, determines in law and in terms of accountability what happens in SIMM. And what SIMM does is obtains resources, both human resources, i.e. people, but also financial resources, and focuses those resources on promoting and supporting researchers, research and research training in this field. And so far, the main focus, the regular focus, the thing you can expect to find every year, are meetings. And there are 2 types of meeting: large annual symposia typically attracting over 100 people in a quite traditional format. People submit abstracts and then they go to the symposium and present their work in a 20-minute or whatever it is paper, which is then discussed. More perhaps unusual are the intensive annual seminars, which generally are, well, we've only had 2, but the aim is to keep them small, under 25, and the purpose is to be developmental for early career researchers, mainly but not exclusively doctoral students. And we define what SIMM is doing with these activities as bringing researchers together to advance the field. And it's doing that in 4 ways. Connecting researchers to each other so they can dialogue, share their research, both their issues and their findings and their dilemmas. Connecting researchers to developments in research that they might not have heard about. Connecting researchers to practitioners also, because many practitioners are interested in SIMM because they are interested in research, usually, but not exclusively, research into their own practice. And SIMM supports and stimulates research training initiatives, mainly at doctoral level, of which this seminar that's just finished is the main example. And SIMM sees itself as a scholarly society, therefore, because that's what scholarly societies do, but also as a change agent, working to make the field stronger and more visible, and therefore attracting more interest, more resource, more support over time. That's our fervent hope. So the SIMM Research Seminar Series, of which one has just finished, are intensive 3 to 4 day courses with groups of about 20 early career researchers from different disciplines and backgrounds, accompanied by experts, both researchers and practitioners, from the field of social artistic work to provide support, facilitation, and guest lecturers. And the key feature of these seminars is that participants present their research to one another, not as a finished product, but as something in development with many issues and questions still to resolve, and to engage in peer discussion and with the facilitators in order to move their own research forward in some way. Each seminar focuses on particular questions, and this seminar, which just finished, included among its focuses, and there were many focuses, the relationship between research and practice, or between researchers and practitioners. So we have 18 participants. I think all of you are in the room from all over the world, supported by a team of 6 facilitators and administrators. And must particularly acknowledge that this event could not happen without the very, very generous support of a sister organisation, the Society for Education in Music Psychology Research, which has made available generous bursaries to allow people to cover at least part of their travel and subsistence costs. And we really are profoundly grateful to SEMPRE for that. Well, we've been talking about research a lot, and I and colleagues have found that it's necessary to think a little bit about what we mean by research, because people come to this activity and many others maybe with slightly different concepts and slightly different expectations. So this is my take on the kind of research that SIMM, and maybe I am particularly wedded to. Research is systematic critical inquiry. And systematic means it has to have a methodology, and that methodology usually is one which is recognized and developed. Of course, we can be developing new methodologies, but one has to build those on existing methodologies and very often start with those. For me, the key characteristic, or a key characteristic of research, is it must have public outputs. In other words, it must leave a trace beyond the practice itself, which is available to people who were not involved in that practice or were not there in the room at the time, in order to know what the findings were. Now, typically that's publications, but it can also be conference presentations, videos, whatever. But that is the key thing. Research has to be put out into the public domain for anyone to see. And in order for that actually to have any meaning, the research must pose a question of some general interest and relevance to a public audience of some kind. What is that public audience? Well, traditionally and typically, the first audience for research is fellow researchers, is the scholarly community. In research, we share our results and our findings with other researchers and other scholars. But increasingly, particularly in the last 20 years, that has not been seen enough by people who fund and support research. Research needs to demonstrate some relevance to the wider society, that it's not just an internally interesting but not useful line of inquiry. And so research in itself is increasingly expected to have social impact. It's expected to impact on some of the questions that we are asking ourselves as a society. And in my own country, the UK, all research carried out by people with salaried jobs in universities has to show both scholarly rigor, but it also has to show how it could lead to impact in the wider society to get the highest scoring and the highest support. And of course, in the case of SIMM, that impact is very clear. It's an impact on practitioners and those who train and support and commission them. Research often, maybe always, should, but often exposes the work, whatever that work is, to an external and or critical perspective, which makes research different from some other activities which kind of are there and can sometimes be mixed with research or sometimes mistaken for research. One of those is evaluation. And my take on evaluation, and it's a shared take, is that evaluation is primarily private. It's mainly for the benefit of those delivering or hosting or sponsoring the specific practice. So that behind closed doors, you can learn from it and maybe make some changes. It may be that your funders require it, and therefore you focus your evaluation particularly on the issues that funders are looking for. And it tends to be specific to that piece of work. And therefore, not of itself and obviously of interest to the general public. And indeed, sometimes the evaluation is prevented by sponsors or funders from going into the public domain for a number of reasons. Research is also different from practice exchange, useful as practice exchange is. It's wonderful and useful for practitioners to share with each other what they're doing, but sharing with each other what they're doing doesn't, in my and other people's minds, jump over the bar to be researched. It's something else, useful, but it's something else. And SIMM does not particularly exist to support practice exchange. Research is also different from advocacy. And sometimes we have conversations with people who say, my practice is valuable to me and to others. I want to make sure that it continues, and therefore I want to do some activity which will further and promote my activity. Again, that's entirely necessary and admirable, and if we are doing practice, we all need to advocate for our practice. But advocating for practice, again, is not research, because it will lack that critical distance. So what can we say in detail about this emerging field from the perspective of what's been going on in SIMM itself? Well, there has been research, and that research is scattered over many outlets. But what our activity has done is allow a concentration of research and research-oriented presentations to come together in a bundle or a catalogue. So if we look back over the 3 symposia that have so far happened where people could submit papers, and the one seminar which took place last year in Helsinki, that already is possibly the largest curated concentration, or at least a large curated concentration of presented work that we can look at. And this is something I want to share with you a little bit, some analysis of this that I did and presented at the 4th symposium in Bogota, and you'll see at the bottom of the slide a URL which will take you to the full report. So my data set with 112 project-specific abstracts and proposals which were accepted for these events. Everybody wanting to present had to write, I think it was a 300-word abstract of what their investigation inquiry was about. And so looking at these can tell us something in a very empirical, non-judgmental way about what actually this emerging field looks like. Well, the first thing we can look at is which countries the projects are in that have been reported at SIMM events. And up until last year, we had 34 countries represented. Interestingly, 50% of those 34 of those reports were in 5 countries: Brazil, Colombia, UK, Portugal, USA. That might not necessarily reflect the relative number of projects in those countries, although it's probably influenced by that. It also reflects where the people are who first got involved and interested in the SIMM project. Delighted that this seminar this year has added one more country to the list. That's South Africa. I won't say more about this, but one could discuss a little bit more what the geographical spread means and what it implies for the future of our discipline. But I want to move on to another question which this set of data can address. What kind of social impact is being discussed in these presentations? And for this, I simply went through the presentations, picking out words or phrases describing the social impact that was intended or proposed or found. And these phrases were taken verbatim from the abstract of each proposal. Some of the proposals were in Spanish, and I used Google Translate for the English equivalent. And in those 112 abstracts, I actually found 66 distinct non-musical words or phrases to characterize the social impact that was being looked at. What I then tried to do, because 66 is an awfully long list, is see whether those could be clustered into related groups and make some kind of tentative beginnings of a map of the kinds of social impact. So this is my take on it. It may be the wrong take, you may have better clusters, but this is at any rate a start. So what you will see on each successive slide, and I'm going to whip through these very quickly because of time, is at the top my best guess at what the cluster of terms below are about. And where you see numbers on the slide, that's the number of abstracts which contained those precise words. So 6 of the abstracts out of the 112 contained the words social cohesion, and so on and so forth. So this first bunch I called social inclusion. And I'm not going to read them all out, but for example, there are things like cultural inclusion, community connectedness, words like that. The second cluster is social justice, with concepts such as human dignity, women's rights, etc. Third, cultural visibility. For example, preservation of local culture, overcoming cultural stereotypes. Fourth, peace and reconciliation. So, peace building, memory of war, and other linked concepts. Fifthly, collaboration. Words like cooperation, solidarity. Sixthly, empowerment. So, improve confidence, empower to make positive decisions. Seventh, self-development. So, self-esteem, openness to the new. Eighth, identity. So, could be personal identity, national identity, professional identity. Trust, creation of attachments, empathy, pro-social behavior. Violence reduction, crime reduction, rehabilitation. Health, a small group, but there was some there. Recovery from surgery, for example. And a whole bunch of one-offs which I couldn't put into any category, but maybe some cleverer person could. Concepts of resilience, cultural competence, and so on. Well, what do we do with all of that? Well, I thought that at least I should put these categories into some kind of framework which uncovers some potential dimensions here. And again, this is very preliminary, and some of the categories may be in the wrong place. But I could see two things going on within these types of activity. One is to do with the target, whether the target of the change, whatever that change is mediated through a group or through an individual who then goes on to have social impact. And the other dimension that's kind of apparent in this is whether the impact is inwards into the person concerned or the group concerned, or whether the thrust of that impact is much more directly outwards, out from the group, out from the individual, towards others. So clearly health is pertaining to an individual in the first instance, and it's something about their inner change. Whereas cultural visibility, to take one on the other extreme, seems to be something that culture can only be visible in the sense of a group presenting that culture, the cultural members of that culture, and the visibility is to others out there. And you may need all kinds of internal things in order to be empowered to be visible out there, but the thrust is outwards. That's just an example of the kind of thinking that might be done to reduce the space. Because if we are left with 66 different kinds of social impact, and each of those 66 types of social impact needs to be researched, we're going to be here for centuries. So somehow we need to find some smart ways of thinking, well, that's like that, so if we research this, then we'll probably also understand that, or we have a better chance of understanding that. But I then went on for another question, which is, what kinds of people do the musicians who are doing this kind of work do the work with? And so it was the same task again. Words or phrases describing constituents were taken verbatim from the abstract of each proposal and presentation. And we also got a very large list of constituents. 58 distinct words and phrases were discovered. So exactly as before, these were clustered into tentative groups. So the first group is a group defined by occupational or study status. Groups like students, but also some rather more unusual ones, healthcare professionals, sex workers. Groups which were defined by the fact that they were already, in some sense, doing music together. And this was some kind of augmentation or intervention with groups doing music. So, orchestras, choirs, festival attenders. Quite a lot of the groups were defined by their health status. People with HIV, blind people, people with dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Work was being done with groups in or emerging from conflict, refugees, ex-combatants, survivors of war. Some work was being done with displaced and homeless people, displaced or homeless for a variety of reasons, ranging from earthquake survivors to street children to prison inmates. Work was done with marginalised and geographically defined groups, for example, urban youth in areas of high migrant population, historically denigrated indigenous communities, and so on. Groups defined socioeconomically, for example, low-income inner-city residents, but not only deprivation, there has also been research on upper-class white children, looking particularly at their positionality within society and how they might be helped to be more aware of and empathetic to others in their society through music. There were groups defined by age: children, older people. And again, a tentative classification of those categories. It seems to me that some of the groups are defined by what the people do, so occupational groups, musicians. Some of the groups are defined by what people have suffered or experienced, so their health status, in or emerging from a conflict, displaced and homeless. And others groups are defined by what or where they are, so they might be defined by their socio-economic status or their age. So, what's the implication, or some of the implications of all of this? There's an utterly incredible, overwhelming variety of intended social impact in projects with an incredible variety of constituents. So a question for us is, can the research field move towards some kind of useful typology which, for example, might assist in the determination of suitable research methods? And there are also challenges around generalizability. If you do research on a project building self-confidence in street children in a particular context, what can you take from that project which is applicable in some way to other kinds of social impact in other kinds of context? Or can't you? So if you have 66 different kinds of social impact and 58 different types of constituency, and we probably haven't got them all, that's a 66 times 58 matrix. Is there any way of filling that in a general way? I don't know, but it's slightly alarming, I think, to me. Now, what I'm going to move on to finish the presentation is some issues kind of connected to that, which were raised or sharpened in my mind, and I have to say this is an entirely personal take based on what I overheard. The conversations were incredibly rich, wide-ranging, simultaneously different conversations on different tables. So the richness of those 3 days is impossible to capture other than what each of you who was present took away in your own head. This is what I have taken away, or some of what I've taken away in my head. I was very, very intrigued and interested in a question which was set to the group by the facilitators. And the question is, what is social impact in distinction to other forms of impact? And I think everybody found that a challenging question, but the kinds of answers that were coming up, that I overheard and participated in, is that a social impact is an impact that affects other people. It affects relationships, and at the top level, it might even affect social structures or social organization. And one group talked, I think, very effectively, and I think visuals are very useful here, of concentric circles of impact. And so if you look at that concentric circle there, the circle right in the middle is the impact that takes place within the group of people actually doing the music making together at a particular place in a particular time. There will clearly be impact happening on those people and also as a group. Go out a level and you might get to impact on people who they go home to, people who they walk out of the activity and meet and interact with, family, friends, immediate circle. Going beyond that, it might impact on the local community as a whole, and maybe at some ultimate level, it could impact on the society at large. So a dilemma here is that I think almost every group that I overheard and participated in came to the conclusion that actually all impact is social impact. If it involves humans, there is going to be some impact on their relationships and on others not present in the activity. So that's good to think, but it's also problematic to think if we're trying to define a field which has some limits and boundaries to it. So a question that arises for me is, if all music activity has potential social impact, should we include every type of musical activity in every context as a focus for SIMM research? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I think we need a pragmatic solution. Otherwise, we just become the music research organization, and that's not really where we want to be. And I think, looking at how SIMM has actually positioned itself, it wants to support types of research that are not so well supported elsewhere by the kinds of structures and organizations that are already in place. So you could say music education in schools is hugely well supported by a whole range of organizations, scholarly bodies, etc., who allow people to meet and discuss research in this area. One of those being, of course, the International Society for Music Education, ISME, of which I think some of you in the room are also members. So by and large, the SIMM activities we've looked at have not been classroom music tuition. Similarly, in many countries, including the UK where I come from, there is a huge amount of resource and groups and organizations to discuss research based on music and health. And sometimes they expand that to health and well-being. There's a huge amount of money available in that area, a lot of government money available, and so in a sense, SIMM is occupying the space that music and health doesn't occupy. And finally, there is clinical applications of music, such as clinical music therapy, where a doctor prescribes a patient a course of treatment, and the course of treatment that is prescribed for that patient is some music therapy sessions. Empirically, that kind of work has not been brought to SIMM, although I've had very interesting discussions with music therapists about the changing nature of the music therapy profession. And I've learned that many music therapists are now opening the doors on that private, closed clinical practice and are starting doing group music therapy work in voluntary settings with people who haven't been prescribed by a doctor to get it. So maybe music therapists are moving into SIMM, and that's an interesting thing to actually look at. I think another thing, which is pragmatic also, is that we are, by, again, looking at who comes to SIMM events and who presents their work, that we are prioritizing work where there is an explicit social or activist agenda articulated by the musician or the project itself. And I think by doing that, we can avoid what I've called bandwagoning. I think a lot of musicians realize that social impact is a buzzword which can bring them kudos, could bring them funding, etc. And so a musician who's doing something what I would call quite ordinary, doing concerts in concert halls, can stick their hands up and say, oh, but what I do has social impact too. Can I join the club? And of course, we have to have a decision about that. But I think at the moment, we're saying, no, we want to focus on a different kind of thing. So there's a kind of logic here, which I think we want to just challenge. And the logic is this, and anybody can say this. I do music. True. Music has social impact. Also true. Therefore, my music has social impact. And that can lead to a somewhat unreflective, uncritical acceptance of the narrative that music of any sort, in any circumstance, is healing, or, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think the founding impulse of our work and our club, or the founding impulse for me, is work such as done by Geoffrey Baker in his wonderful book, El Sistema, Orchestrating Venezuela's Youth. If anybody comes to me and says, what's this SIMM thing? Show me some research which is exemplary, I have no hesitation. I point them straight to Geoffrey Baker's book. Because you read this and then come back. So if any of you haven't read his book, try somehow and get hold of a copy. Because it is in some ways very, very sobering, even shocking, how he dissects the El Sistema movement and shows that their attested and much publicized social impact objectives are hardly realized in what they actually do. Another question that came up is how research can measure long-term impacts. And there's a dilemma here, I think, particularly for a research area which does not receive vast amounts of government funding anywhere in the world. The easiest and cheapest access to impacts in terms of measuring or trying to understand them is clearly short-term. And the most short-term of all is what happens in the room. What impacts are happening while the music is taking place, and how these people who've been involved in this activity, as it were, go out of the room different in some way, immediately afterwards. But there's also an intellectual reason for concentrating on immediate impacts, because they can be much more easily attributed to the intervention that you've just been part of than long-term ones, which get mixed up with all kinds of other things that that person may be involved in, family, other activities, changes in society, and so on. So the further you get away in time from the intervention, the more problematic it is to demonstrate that that intervention had a significant impact on outcomes. And I think I would say that the research community is not good at measuring and understanding long-term impacts. And even if there were good methods for doing it, it's incredibly expensive, because you have to actually have the same research team, or at least successors of the same research team, constituted over decades. It doesn't fit very well within the standard 3-year doctorate. So maybe we just have to accept where we are, and that some modesty is required, that we accept that short-term and local impacts are the likely limits currently of most SIMM work that's being done. And that is valuable, and it's simply pragmatic. Another question which came up was how to ensure that the research is accessible and useful to the world of practice. And there were some very graphic descriptions of the pressures which a research community, an international research community, places on researchers. It pushes them towards highly academic outputs, such as theses and peer-reviewed journals, which have very low accessibility to practitioners and communities, both through cost, style of language. Some researchers' language is very impenetrable to a non-researcher, and also, as was raised also in some discussions, language, because there's more and more a pressure for researchers to be publishing in English, and I'm not proud of that as an English native speaker, but that is the reality that researchers have to face. And they have to balance that with an ethical obligation, and there was much very useful talk about ethics and what are our ethical obligations as researchers. But one primary one is to give back to the community from which you, in a sense, took data, to respect that local community and also empower and inform them. And there are a large number of methods of doing that, but it needs to be done at least locally through workshops and other participatory events where you go back to the participants and say, well, this is what we found, here it is for you. Another way of ensuring that research is useful to the world of practice is to actually have the practitioner be doing the research or being part of the research, so that being involved in research immediately or over time impacts on your practice. And there was quite a lot of discussion about what are the different advantages and disadvantages of researchers being the practitioners who are delivering the musical activity, or researchers who are, as it were, standing outside it and looking in. And I think there's no right answer to that. We probably need both. But it's interesting that quite a lot of the impetus for SIMM and what keeps SIMM meetings full is practitioners wanting a research perspective to their practice. Not entirely. I mean, I'm not a practitioner and I never will be, and I've been drawn to this area because I'm interested in the social impact. But I think if you count the number of people and count the number of papers in those 112, I would say practitioners are more than half. And something which was also said in the meeting is that one needs to build networks and relationships where practitioners and others meet. Also the public, people were talking about Twitter and blogs and so on. But I have a particular concern, which perhaps reflects where I am, that a very important way of making research accessible and useful is by embedding it in higher education institutions, such as conservatoires, where the research can be disseminated through the training that one is offering to practitioners in those institutions. And I can say explicitly, because it has been expressed publicly as an explicit long-term aim, is that my conservatoire, the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, wants, over time, to develop a social impact curriculum or socially engaged curriculum which will be compulsory for every student who goes through the door. Not an elective, not an optional, because they recognise that socially impactful work is different to concert work, and it's becoming more and more common, and if a musician is going to, as it were, be able to find their way in the 21st century world of employment, they need to be able to they need to have an initial toolkit for such work. Another thing which came up is the notion of arts work, such as music work, as a sticking plaster to replace or to cover up the gaps in structural provision. And this came particularly through a challenging provocation by Pascal Gielen at the Antwerp Research Institute for the Arts, which is where our seminar took place. And his suggestion was that SIMM work could well be, and perhaps is being in some cases, co-opted to a neoliberal political agenda, in that arts interventions can be a cheap, even though inadequate, substitute for what's really needed, which is sustainable social and economic provision within a community. And so that leads to the thought that actually more research is needed on the political and policy environment in which SIMM projects operate. Because such environments may place pressures on practitioners and researchers to overclaim success and to bury failure. But I think we all know in our hearts that true learning only often follows from failure and understanding why you failed. And we must find ways of having policymakers and funders and sponsors accept that it could be more useful to the field as a whole to understand why a project failed rather than to bury the bad news. So, a final point, I think, getting towards, yes, the final point, is something which I've been struggling with for ever since I first met Lucas and I've first been involved in SIMM. And I've headed this music and social change, stroke, music or social change. What do I mean by this? It's clear to me that much of the SIMM work, which I've come across in the years I've been involved with the society, is undertaken by musicians who want to serve society in more direct ways than can be usually achieved on the concert platform. And that's admirable and inspiring, and it's good that it happens. And it's better that such work exists than that it doesn't. But one can ask the question, if the goal of whatever human activity one is doing is social change, is music always the best way to achieve it? Now, that's not a question which is being asked very much in our research field yet, but it's beginning to be asked by some researchers. And so there is some comparative research going on, comparing, for example, music as a group intervention to sport as a group intervention, and saying, actually, could the sport be as good as or better than music? And what would the implications of that be? But also, suppose that significant social change requires different kinds of activity altogether, not cultural activity, but something which is more connected to the political sphere or the social work sphere. It could well be that someone who is passionately committed to social change might come to a moment where they say, actually, I need to do something else than music to achieve the social change I really want. But I also think that a lot of people who are attracted to the SIMM agenda put music first. That the bottom line is that they have to go on doing music practice every day for the rest of their lives. That's non-negotiable. What they can then do is modulate that musical activity in order to make it more socially impactful, if that's something that they're interested in doing. But I'd be very interested, and this would be a research topic, to find musicians around the world who stopped being musicians because their commitment to social change was greater than their commitment to music. And then what happened to them? But I don't know any research which goes anywhere near that yet. But I think it's something that we all should perhaps just think about. Are we so wedded to music that we don't want to look really at any other tool? That's our bottom line. I'm going to do music, but I can do it more or less socially impactful, which is fine, but it just might place limits on what kinds of social impact actually, realistically, we can achieve, even if we would want to achieve more. And I think that's the point at which I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.